is Firstline with Daniel Pizarro.
Good evening. Australia goes to the polls on May 3rd after Prime Minister Anthony Albanese visited Government House in Canberra and was granted a dissolution of Parliament by the Governor-General. The Prime Minister is aiming for a second term, saying there's a clear difference between him and the opposition. Here's what he had to say in Canberra.
And your choice has never been more clear. This election is a choice between Labor's plan to keep building or Peter Dutton's promise to cut. That is the choice. That is your choice. Your job, your wages, your child's education, and importantly as well, this thing here, your Medicare card, they're all in your hands. Because only Labor has the plan to make you better off over the next 3 years. Only Labor is acting on the cost of living. Only a vote for Labor will keep your wages growing. Take 20% off your student debt and cut taxes again and again for every taxpayer next year and the year after.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton made his budget response last night and also kicked off the Coalition's campaign, though he has faced a decline in support, especially over his nuclear policy and plans to slash 41,000 public service jobs. But he says his plans would cut down on the cost of living.
And the Coalition has an achievable plan to get our country back on track. That's why a Coalition government will cut fuel excise by 25 cents a litre, so that every time you fill up your car or your ute at the Bowser, it's about $14 cheaper. Our plan will help get our country back on track. A government I lead will build a strong economy with low inflation. And we will deliver this by reining in the wasteful spending that fuels inflation. We will reduce tax, red tape, and we will take control again of building sites and take them away from the CFMEU and the organised crime groups. We want to make sure that we can make building sites safe again, that we can make construction affordable again in our country. We'll deliver cheaper energy to families and small businesses. I think this is a really important point and one of the big points of difference between what Labor will offer at this election and what the Coalition will offer.
One of the biggest issues brewing in this campaign is the state of regional healthcare. Funding comes from both the state and federal governments, but despite the push to get more people into regional communities, the healthcare system has struggled to keep up, especially as many people don't have easy access to treatment. Joining me is Chief Executive of the National Rural Health Alliance, Susi Tegan, who is demanding all parties and candidates take this issue seriously. Ms. Tegan, thank you so much for joining me here on Firstline today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
There are quite a few big developments that's happened. We've had the federal budget, we've had the opposition leader's budget reply, and now today Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has finally called the election for May the 3rd. And we know that, especially from your perspective, you want rural health and regional health to be at the forefront of all the candidates who are running. What is first your biggest concern at the moment, especially out of first the budget that was announced by Jim Chalmers?
Well, first of all, it's great that the election has been called because people have been waiting for it for quite some time. The budget was really a culmination of releases that had been made over several weeks. And yes, there was some really good things out of it, cheaper medicine for one, which is really important when there's a cost of living crisis in particular. There's also very small energy relief, which is welcome. And then there was the Medicare bulk billing changes, which is great for those practices that can afford to bulk bill, purely because they have the throughput or they're a corporate. But we also know that many of the rural, remote and regional clinics, multidisciplinary clinics, often cannot afford to fully bulk bill their patients because the patients' needs are often very large in those regions. We know that rural people are sicker. They are also they're dying earlier than urban Australia. And the biggest concern that we have, and I know it goes across all the different portfolios across Australia, if it has to do with rural is definitely undercooked. 2/3 of Australia's income comes from that 30% of the population that lives in rural, remote and regional Australia. They only make up 7.3 million people, but they're very important because our income comes from there. And so it is important that, first of all, we have an equitable access to the income. In terms of health, we want to make sure that rural people get the care that they deserve and the funding that is equitable to that what is expended on those people that live in the city. And at the moment, we actually have a $6.55 billion underspend per year in rural Australia. So if you live outside of the city, you're getting $850 less health expenditure on you because of where you live. And yet we need you to deliver the economic gains for the rest of Australia. So you're bringing in 90% of the food Australians eat because you live in rural Australia. You're also bringing in 50% of the tourism income, despite the fact that you only make up 30% of the population. And you're bringing in 2/3 of Australia's export income. And so we're saying where market fails, or the market is thin, or there is no market for healthcare delivery, as there is in the Tamworth region, in the New England region, where you've got a shortage of doctors, you've got a shortage of nurses, allied health professionals, dentists, specialists. We need to look at things differently. And we have not seen that in the budget. And we have not seen in the budget that there would be some block or blended funding to support those communities that are not able to make ends meet to meet the need of the population. We're also not seeing in the budget at the moment, we're hoping that no matter which party is vying for the political vote, that they will look at infrastructure funding where we can have housing for those health students or medical students that need to go to regions or stay in regions, for those specialists or nurses or allied health professionals that go to the regions. We need to make sure that there's infrastructure funding for expansion of services, because what's actually happening at the moment is there is no accommodation, and if there is any, they have to share. Their families can't come with them. We're not able to keep the existing workforce. You in the Tamworth region have gone through fires 24, 25. You had a fire in 2019. You are resilient. You continuously come back up. And this is happening all around rural Australia.
And more people are coming to these communities. Like Tamworth's population has increased. We know the mining boom has helped places like Gunnedah also increase. But at the same time, we've seen rental prices tighten very dramatically. Yes. I know that there's been some disappointment from the redevelopment of the Gunnedah Hospital that oncology and dialysis will no longer be offered as part of this new redevelopment. And we know that as these larger communities get more and more people into them, those who might be seeking those specialised services or those more unique services will still have to find that they have to travel either to a bigger hospital. If you're in Gunnedah, you have to go to maybe Tamworth, or if you're in Tamworth, you have to go to Newcastle or even Sydney or Brisbane. There's a lot of this pressure that is then being put on the local health districts from more people trying to get in, or those who have those really unique or specialised services that they require and that treatment.
Absolutely. So in a rural area, unlike the city, if industry falls down, the health system and the education system falls down. If health falls down, industry and education fall down. You need all of them to work together. And so if you don't invest in the health system for those people, and then and you expect people, when they're already underfunded, you expect them to travel to major centres, and through the patient assistance transport scheme, you're giving them 46 cents when the cost of fuel is actually 75 to 78 cents, right? And accommodation patient assistant funding is $100 or $120, and it actually costs you $200 to be in a accommodation at the local hospital in the city. People are making a choice. They're going, I can't afford to do that. Or they're saying, I can't afford to be away from my job because that means I don't have an income. Or I can't afford to be away from my family because there is nobody else to support them. And so it's a real problem. Not only are we not providing them the service, then we're basically saying to people, oh, you're only worthy of getting 46 cents, despite the fact that we know it costs this much. And I can tell you, most employees working for a company or working for the government, they wouldn't be getting 46 cents. They would be receiving reimbursement. And so we need to make sure that if we can't provide a service and there is no public services available and there is no public transport, what are we going to do to make sure that there is equitable access? These people are all Australians, and we are fighting on behalf of those rural Australians because we believe that everyone should have universal access to healthcare.
And have you been able to have a look at what the opposition leader Peter Dutton's budget response last night about how I know that there's a lot of issues regarding not like cost of living that he was trying to address, as well as maybe looking at electricity, energy supplies, but also I know, and quite controversially, plans to axe 41,000 public service jobs. Now, the biggest issue with those in the APS would be those who would be in the regional areas, and if there were any senior or public health service people in our regional areas with the health departments, this could stretch those remaining employees quite thin and could make delivering healthcare services even more difficult from a federal perspective. Is that a concern for you?
Yeah, well, it is, because, I mean, your region, New England region, is cereal crops, it's poultry processing, it's mills and abattoirs and cotton producing. But in addition to that, you do have manufacturing and you do have a large health workforce. And we're very much for regional communities being, able to have jobs that actually are federal or state, and not always being in the city. And so if you're asking me about cuts, look, I can't comment about the cuts to which service, but I can say we don't want any cuts in rural Australia because they are already cut as much as you can. And we need to have rural communities with employment, with a vibrant environment. And it's really important that we don't cut further from rural communities. We do believe that the cost of fuel is too high, and if there is a reduction, that helps people with their out-of-pocket costs, and it allows them to make a decision about whether they seek healthcare as opposed to paying the bills, as opposed to buying food. So anything like that is helpful. That includes energy costs, ongoing costs, and if it means that overseas markets have to wait compared to local markets, we're happy because it means that our consumers have access at a lower cost.
Also, the biggest pressing issues for a lot of the regional healthcare sector is that of Indigenous health. Given that we know that there are many closing the gap targets that have yet to be addressed, most notably, of course, we've got life expectancy, quality of health, survival rates among various diseases, of course, ranging from breast cancer, heart disease. We were speaking off air just a few minutes ago where I said that a lot of Indigenous women have been urged to get mammograms at the age of 40, well before non-Indigenous women have been suggested to get a mammogram, because not only are they more likely to develop breast cancer, it's also going to be more aggressive, and their survival rates would be significantly lower. And these are some women who are living in not as high living standards compared to others, as well as many of them living in very remote areas as well. So there's all these different factors that can make their chances of a full recovery quite dented too.
Oh, absolutely. So you just have to look at the recently released Closing the Gap campaign. The statistics are not getting better. And considering 2/3 of Australian Aboriginal people live in rural and remote Australia, it is crucial that we look after our Aboriginal people. We know that Indigenous people have higher rates of diabetes. They do have earlier onset of breast cancer from the findings that have been released. In addition to that, we also know that some of the issues are trauma related. And then we also have the dialysis story. And you telling me that dialysis are not going to be part of the service, well, what does that mean for people? Why is that we're not able to deliver those services? And why do you have to live in the city or in a major place when it actually stops the productivity? You're having to go somewhere 3 times a week for a long period of time during that day when you could actually be productive. And so I think it's really important that we look after Indigenous people and rural people and make sure that they have access, but not with additional burdens where they can't afford the cost of fuel, the accommodation, the time away from work, the time away from their mob, all of those things. Like rural Australia should not be dying earlier. It shouldn't be done. We're a Western country, and we're saying because of the lack of commitment that we're okay with it. We're standing on the sideline. The good thing I have to say in this budget, in terms of Indigenous people, was that we would be providing more opportunity for people to train in medicine for Indigenous people, and that we are going to be training more rural generalists. That is really important, but it's a long leadway. It usually takes about 12 years, 13 years to get through medicine. You've got your 5 or 6 years of medicine, then you've got a year or 2 of internship, and then you've got your training, whether it's general practice or specialist. And so it's a long leeway. And so we really need to make sure that we treat the people on the ground that are working there now well, because it's easier to keep people than it is to recruit new people. And let's just recruit students from rural schools and ensure that they get into health careers and medicine.
And it's funny how in trying to address some of these issues, there's been this stigma against trying to attract doctors and GPs and nurses from overseas to try and help at least fill these gaps, because as you just said, it can take 12 years to complete a course, and some of these communities they are either lacking doctors and are stretched so thin, or some towns, like as we were talking earlier, Uralla didn't have a doctor for months on end until they were finally able to get one. And a lot of these doctors are ones who have agreed to come to Australia, and many of them settle down and hopefully settle down in our regional areas. And yet there's this weird stigma against trying to bring in international doctors who can provide these services straight away.
Yeah, look, more than 50%, well, actually around 50% of the doctors in rural, remote and regional Australia, and these are the generalists, so GPs, are now international medical graduates. We've been recruiting people for the last 35, 40 years to rural Australia. And there's some amazing doctors that have committed and have become part of the family. It is not the only solution. Even, allied health professionals and nurses from international environments, some of them don't fit into the culture. They don't have any interest in the culture. And so it is really important that that is seen as only one solution. It is part of a suite of solutions, including infrastructure, including change in legislation, including change in the way we currently treat our doctors, the way we employ doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, dentists. It's really about, let's change the way we treat people, and let's have workforce strategies that are fit for purpose for rural, because the ones that we currently use are not working, and the ones that are developed in the city for city solutions are not working in rural. We actually need community approaches. You know, it needs to involve the tourism industry. As I told you before, 50% of the tourism income comes from those regions. We need to involve industry, because 2/3 of our export incomes are industry, you know. So we really need to have a holistic, whole of system approach and a regional approach, just like the Aboriginal Health Services sector does, where you look at the population health need and then you come up with solutions. And it needs to be enabled and it needs to be flexible, because otherwise you will continue to get what we've always got and be surprised.
And finally, Ms. Tegan, during this election campaign, will you really want to try and meet up with the health ministers or the shadow spokespeople, various other candidates, really try to hammer down your concerns and your pitches during these next couple of weeks?
Yeah, look, we're partly funded by the federal government, which basically means the taxpayer. And our remit is to ensure that we send the messages we're getting from the health workforce, we're getting from the communities, industry, and we definitely want to meet with the minister and the rural health minister and the opposition. We will work with anybody that will listen to us, and we need to make sure that our communities are being heard, because rural communities are the backbone of Australian economy and also society.
Susi Tegan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Just days before the election was called, Treasurer Jim Chalmers handed down the federal budget. The atmosphere was one of quiet optimism, a budget seemingly designed not to spook the Reserve Bank regarding interest rates. There are careful, modest financial reforms and a tax cut for all Australians, which won't come into effect until 2026. Tonight, we take a look at key aspects of the budget, how it will affect Australians and what it means for our economic future. First, here's the Treasurer as he tabled the budget to the House of Representatives on Tuesday night.
A plan to help with the cost of living, with 2 new tax cuts and higher wages, more bulk billing and more help with electricity bills, cheaper medicine and less student debt. It's a plan to build Australia's future, with more homes, new investments in skills and education, competition reforms and a future made in Australia. Yeah. Speaker, our economy is turning the corner. Inflation is down, incomes are rising, unemployment is low, interest rates are coming down, debt is down, and growth is picking up momentum. On all of these fronts, our economy and our budget are in better shape than they were 3 years ago. Yeah. Now, this progress has been exceptional but not accidental. The credit belongs to Australians in every corner of our country. We've come a long way together, but there is more work to do. This budget is our plan for a new generation of prosperity in a new world of uncertainty. It's a plan to help finish the fight against inflation, rebuild living standards and maximise our national advantages into the future.
On the morning after the budget, I spoke to NRN Federal Political Reporter Noah Secomb for his take. Well, Noah, thank you so much for joining me. We know that there's a lot of detail in this budget, and looking at the general mood of the situation, I would say that this is a budget that is of quiet optimism. It looks like there's some really positive things, but Jim Chalmers is not going massively all out when it comes to spending. How have you found what he has been announcing since Tuesday night?
Well, it's quite a development, really, that shouldn't come as much of a surprise because Treasurer Jim Chalmers has a habit of, in the days and weeks leading up to a budget night, to really just downplay any major spending that the government's going to do, because there is just this never-ending sort of reputation of, Labor governments spend and liberal governments, they don't and they conserve money and all that. So it's really just pushing against this kind of idea that's just hung around the government. Of course, in the last budget, we saw a similar sort of routine. He was pretty much pulling the exact same talking points as this year, saying, it's focused on repair and reform, and it's all modest changes. And the big one, of course, is the tax cuts, where even though this is the second round of tax cuts that are being delivered in a parliamentary term, they're very simple and they only take effect in a year's time, so they don't interrupt with things like inflation. So there are new things hidden within it, but it's certainly not an all-out spend, a wild sort of free-for-all in any sense of the word. In fact, it's quite it's based on things that we've already known for quite a few months, and it certainly reads as more of a pre-election pitch than necessarily a brand new budget to take us into a different year.
You mentioned, of course, we really know that this wasn't a budget that was expected to be handed down, because the general gist was everyone was expecting Anthony Albanese to call the election a couple of weeks ago, but ex-tropical cyclone Alfred threw a spanner in the works, and it was, of course, more prudent for the federal government to be focusing on helping with disaster relief payments to assist the Queensland and New South Wales governments. And that meant that we would have to have this budget being handed down instead of going into an election campaign as well. True.
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends who you talk to be honest, because my theory is that the government is going to try and go full term to prove that it can stay the course. Of course, go back a few weeks, and yeah, the week before we saw Cyclone Alfred bear down on southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales, there was all this talk that, yeah, all the polling booths were getting ready, all the major parties were getting their campaigns together. And I mean, it was quite insane. Even just the timing of some of the admin on our side, you had to sign up for the budget lockup on the Friday before the cyclone. So a lot of people were saying, oh, no, we don't really need to worry about that. We're not going to a budget. But of course, yeah, that has thrown the spanner in the works. We're no longer going to the April 12 election date, and it does push it back to May. And I do think in the weeks since the cyclone, and we'll see whether or not this week there's any improvement necessarily in the polls, but we have seen that in recent weeks, that the government is giving itself more time to kind of talk about what it's trying to achieve and what it's doing. And I think that the budget, as much as they may say, oh, we weren't expect, as much as others might say that they weren't expecting it. I think it's actually going to help the government campaign with a bit more credibility, because they have all the numbers and the costings and the actual detail to all of their policies heading into an election campaign, which is really the ideal position to be in. It's just whether or not these policies are successful or popular with the public, and whether or not, I mean, journalists like myself are able to go through and find out where the gaps are. So yeah, it certainly was a quieter budget than previous years, but there's still, I think the government had been preparing for this and sitting on this for quite some time.
So the big surprise, of course, we have the tax cuts. We also have the electricity rebates. The federal government has been very keen on saying that they're pushing down on electricity costs. The cost of living has, of course, been quite a popular push from the government as well as the federal opposition. What do you make of some of the cost of living pressures? We have these tax cuts, as we mentioned, which will be usually, depending on how much you own, would be at least some relief. The electricity rebates of about $150 is also certainly going to be welcome. And we have, of course, this massive HEX debt relief that has been announced that will be very happy for about 3 million students as well. So this is quite good, especially those students in more regional areas, as like studying at the University of New England.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are certainly positives on the surface level to all of these policies, and they have been welcomed, of course. There haven't been like it would be hard to suggest that providing savings to households would be negative, but we have heard from groups like ACOS, the Council of Social Services head Cassandra Goldie. Last night she was saying that there's just this massive gap where, for those who are under that tax threshold, there is actually no support for them in the budget at all. And so we're in this same sort of discussion as last year that we had with the stage 3 tax cuts being changed then, that we're now saying, okay, cool, that does actually help every taxpayer, but there are still like the lowest income Australians who are already struggling the most aren't actually getting a leg up at all in this budget. Last year, the government threw around this middle Australia idea. And again, the kind of people that will benefit the most from some of these measures are likely those sort of middle income sort of households, not those on the lowest. So, and even to the electricity rebate extension, it's only for 6 months, and it's also only $75 a quarter, which a lot of people have not even registered that this has been happening for a year now already. And I mean, electricity costs are just one element in the cost of living. We've heard from advocates saying that it helps. It'll never be turned down, but it's just not making a dent on the things that really are hitting households, like grocery prices, and even to HECS. There's this. It's one of these long-term debts that, for a lot of people that do go into higher education, it's something you don't necessarily think about at the time of your study, but it is also designed in that way that, it's not being actively, you're not really getting interest added to it. It's just being indexed. Although the savings, of course, as someone with a HECS debt myself, are very welcome, but it's certainly targeted at, people with a higher education, with, a household that has already gotten above the tax threshold. And even something else like the Help to Buy scheme, they've extended the eligibility so that people on a higher income can actually apply for this, and for houses of a higher cost. So it's certainly moving a lot of these supports towards that more middle range income, and not just the lower end, and in fact kind of completely missing this low income household demographic.
Yes, that's one aspect, because I know that the Treasurer was also talking about, when it came to education qualifications, really trying to push through with that big investment in tertiary education qualifications as well as TAFE. So really trying to emphasise to school leavers that the best way for them to have a sustainable and fulfilling life after school would be to have these tertiary qualifications as well. That's something I did also notice.
This whole university TAFE discussion has been quite a long-standing point of conversation for the government during this term. The Universities Accord, which is getting passed in stages throughout the last few months and last year, it's got parts that we've been discussing a lot of this stuff for a while. And I think that's the difficulty with this budget, actually, is going through and finding what is new. So the HECS debt announcements, they were made ages ago. They've already been costed in the last budget. And so we're just kind of reminding everyone that here it is again. To the point of TAFE placements as well, the government is really keen on fee-free TAFE as an achievement of this government. And so they've baked in this legislation to have 100,000 fee-free TAFE positions annually from 2027, which, as we know, the opposition aren't too keen on, but it's something that they're saying is not only going to be essential, but it's key to Labor's whole platform of, equity in education. And of course, this will cost $1.6 billion, but the idea is that 9 out of 10 jobs in the future are going to require some sort of higher education. So again, in terms of the sort of modesty in the decisions made in this budget, there's certainly a feeling that the government is trying to prepare for the future, but not going absolutely wild in how it does that.
Now, speaking of the future, we also had references to Future Made in Australia. We, of course, know that this is one of the current government's big pushes, and this is, of course, it's spun off into a portfolio with the Assistant Trade Minister, Senator Tim Ayres, really pushing through this. We also had the emphasis on Made in Australia, as well as extra infrastructure support for farmers, particularly filling in the NBN gaps as well. I had a message from New South Wales farmers saying that there's still a lot of gaps, particularly in infrastructure, that need to be filled and fixed. So they're not 100% supportive of what has been announced. What is your take on some of the things that could really benefit regional areas and particularly our farmers? Because we know that Jim Chalmers did specifically mention farmers and Future Made in Australia as like very important aspects of the budget.
The Future Made in Australia policy, again, one of those pillars of last year's budget and coming up again this year, it certainly seems to be reinvigorated in the face of, US trade issues, like with the Treasurer even singling out aluminium and iron funding, which already had been announced again in last night's speech to kind of make that connection solid. But I do think in terms of where the benefits of that go, for a lot of regional Australia, once you get into the rural and remote areas, they don't actually have these industries to rely on in the first place. So this shift towards, Australian made is absolutely welcome by industry groups and business groups, but it's not necessarily going to be an even improvement across the country. In terms of the infrastructure, we've seen absolute massive gaps for regional Australia, pretty much anywhere south of Queensland. There's, these massive announcements of billions of dollars over the next 10 years for metropolitan Melbourne, the Bruce Highway in Queensland, and the Stuart Highway in the Northern Territory. But for a lot of communities, in the west of New South Wales, there is nothing for anywhere west of Dubbo. And even in healthcare, one of the figures that I've seen recently is that the urgent care clinics, the government's committed to building 50 more of them. And the line that they've said is that now 4 in 5 Australians will live within 20 minutes of an urgent care clinic. But of course, that still leaves 1 in 5 who obviously don't. And when you think of so many of our regional remote communities who simply cannot be covered by 137 clinics across the country. And there's one, the largest health district in New South Wales, the Western Health District. It's the size of Great Britain, and it will have one urgent care clinic in it in Bathurst, in the lowest corner of it, to serve the whole area. So there are, I think, fundamental just differences between the way we consider, funding announcements for major cities in the regions. And there is the whole regional paper in the budget, but it hasn't come through with real big announcements, especially for the things that people need. And some of these ongoing infrastructure projects like Inland Rail or the high-speed rail between Newcastle and Sydney, these are things that seem to be thrown around from agency to agency. We get business cases, we wait for the government to reply, and we just haven't seen any funding in this space for a really long time. So a lot of the things that these regional communities are asking for, and what we've heard from regional organisations overnight, is that there has just not been an investment in regional Australia, with some accusing the government of focusing too much on the cities. So I think that it'll be interesting to see how that, a lot of the people in the most remote areas are typically served by, Nationals, MPs. So it'll be interesting to see whether this budget will actually push people away from, the Nationals or Labor, or how any of this will play out in the next election. And, whether or not they'll even be served under a coalition where, again, really the Nationals are a minority within that. So I think regional Australians have been probably hit the hardest by this budget.
Yes, and we know that a couple of factors is also causing some concern. As you mentioned, the US tariffs, one of the big issues that we have had has been not just the current tariffs, but possible future tariffs on Australian beef and our agricultural sector. As you know, up here in the New England Northwest, we're known as Australia's food bowl, and there has been this concern about farmers and the agricultural industry's livelihoods being dramatically affected, especially if they are not able to or not willing to export out to markets like the United States, and in fact they would have to go elsewhere. And then at the same time they're also dealing with aspects such as disasters like ex-tropical cyclone Alfred has also caused concern as well, the increasing in insurance premiums. We know that farmers and those up here are always worried because their livelihoods can be quite vulnerable in many ways, especially if we have natural disasters or something like a drought as well. That is a bit of a concern too. What's your take on that?
Well, I do think disaster relief in particular has come to the fore following, ex-tropical cyclone Alfred. This extra $1.2 billion that has hit the budget beyond, I think it was the 12.5 billion that was allocated for disaster recovery. And I mean, I think one of the most interesting developments out of that is how the government initially responds and how the media even has responded to that, is that there's this immediate, oh no, the economy, but not necessarily looking at the individuals who are actually, in the face of it. And something like the whole insurance debate, we haven't actually seen anything new in the budget last night about that either. I wouldn't be surprised if the coalition take their budget reply speech on Thursday to reiterate some of the claims that they've made in recent months. However, again, some of their policies around, intervening in insurance companies to make sure that, people are properly covered, that they may not actually commit to that fully. But I do think that there is this, like in terms of the security of, finances for farmers in particularly volatile areas, the government so far has been perhaps trying to use the renewable energy sort of transition as a way that individual producers can bolster their own income if they've got, if they're hosting wind turbines or solar panels. But again, that isn't for every property, and it's not a blanket solution to help producers who are caught in these situations. So it is a difficult problem, and I think it's one of those. It feels like it's one of those policy areas that the government won't be fully addressing in a pre-election budget.
And he also mentioned, of course, the Treasurer, that there were a lot of international factors in this budget, ranging from the US tariffs, we have the Russia-Ukrainian war, we have the continuing war between Israel and Hamas as also key factors in affecting Australia. But it looks like so far our economy is going to grow at a decent rate. Inflation is within the Reserve Bank of Australia's zone, and it looks like even though our debt is going up and we are going into deficit, the government looks like they're quietly confident about managing the numbers and how much debt we are going to go into. How are you taking that?
Certainly heading into the budget, the Treasurer was keen to spruik the government's economic record. And as you say, inflation has come down by more than 1% since the last budget. Unemployment's pretty steady around 4 and a bit percent. And wages are going up. And, the Reserve Bank issued its first rate cut for what felt like an eternity, to be honest. So a lot of the economic indicators have looked good, ultimately, which, heading forward, we know that the Treasury modelling in the budget last night is also suggesting that inflation will come down sustainably 6 months earlier than predicted. So it is genuinely looking positive, and I'm sure the government is happy with that. But a lot of what we've been missing is the admission that, even though the economy is doing well, that doesn't actually really translate to how people are feeling. If you're already struggling to pay your bills and go grocery shopping, then you're not going to be saying, "Oh, thank goodness the economy's doing so well because I'm doing great." Like there's just such a disconnect. So it was good to see that the Treasurer last night he included that there is like might as well quote it directly because he said, "We know that the welcome improvements in the aggregate numbers don't always translate to how people are faring and feeling." So they've kind of made a commitment to perhaps meet people where they are a bit more when they're discussing these economic things. But also it's an impossible situation in many senses because it's not like when we have inflation going up, it's not as if it's going to ever go down. No economist is ever suggesting that prices are magically going to go down. It's a matter of everyone catching up. So whether the government can deliver that, whether, the non-compete clauses and workplace business productivity and all these other things that they're spruiking as, productivity boosting, if that actually works, then perhaps we will see this full recovery that the government is kind of pointing towards.
And finally, Noah, when do you think after the budget goes through Parliament, when do you think Anthony Albanese is going to go to Government House and see the Governor General to call an election?
Oh no. This is the question that everyone has been asking the second we started this year. So to be honest, well, he should have gone before Australia Day. He could have gone in March. He should have gone before Cyclone Alfred. Oh, look, my feeling is that he's going to go full term to almost prove the point that they can do a full 3 years. The final date that it can go is the 17th of March, or 17th of May. And I mean, sure, they could do the 3rd or the 10th, but last night I've heard from others in the press gallery that there's some are suggesting that they'll go to, the budget estimates process to, scrutinize some of the budget, and then the PM will go call the election. But I mean, that's another 2 weeks away. And I for the amount of time that we've been talking about this election already, I mean, I'm getting tired of it. I can't imagine how everyone else in the real world is feeling. Yep. It's going to be a long campaign, no matter how long it actually is. And I mean, there's every chance that the Prime Minister will announce it on Sunday, but he could also wait, just to prove a point. So
we've pretty much been pre-campaigning anyway for the past couple of months.
I mean, when it happens, thank goodness. But till then, yeah, it's anyone's guess, unfortunately. But at least the guesses are down to 3 days.
Noah Secomb, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Daniel.
Meanwhile, some members of the Indigenous community have expressed their mixed reactions to the budget as they feel closing the gap targets aren't being properly addressed. I spoke to CRN Indigenous Affairs reporter Micah Kickett from Parliament House in Canberra. So, Micah, thank you so much for joining us. We know it's been a very busy couple of hours going over what the Treasurer has been saying about this budget. First, what has been some of the feeling from the First Nations people towards this budget, especially as we're about to go into an election?
Yes, certainly. Look, the feeling or the general vibe from community members is that, $1.3 billion is just not enough to cover those disparity and those issues within filling the gaps. And so, look, as it's known, there's only 4 or 5 targets that are on track out of those 19 targets. So, that's a very small portion when you think about that. And so the mob that I've spoken to on the ground, it's just the voices is that just $1.3 billion is what has been announced last night by the Treasurer Jim Chalmers, that'll go towards, not only just closing the gap, but also, to empower First Nations people to be more self-determined, and, have some economic sustainability, but it just still won't address those real live issues in community.
Now, what are some of the most pressing issues, do you think, as part of closing the gap? Because we know that there's over a dozen key points as part of that statement, including like housing and employment. What kind of things have you really thinking aren't being really addressed at the moment?
Yeah, exactly that. And that is what the concerning aspect of this is that the issue that remains is, housing, employment, education, health and well-being, suicide rates, deaths in custody, overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the prison systems. So these are real hardcore issues in hearts of communities that, only that community know about, but people generally do know about. But I guess the viewpoint is that nothing's being done about that, and mainly it's the fact that mob are feeling that the government isn't taking, these issues seriously in relation to closing the gap. Now, in saying that though, what I will say is, in some positive aspect though, I had been speaking to some, community members. Like for example, I'd spoken with not last night after the federal budget was announced, I'd spoken with First Nations advocate Kerry Staines, CEO of the National Family Violence Prevention and Legal Services Forum. Now, while she said that she was disappointed in some aspect because it didn't meet the needs for, their legal services to provide, the services in an adequate way. She was still positive about the fact that, but there is some funding that will go towards closing the gap. And that was a shared view with our CEO, Kathleen Winson, who is the CEO of the Aboriginal Family Legal Services in Queensland and the Warra Warra Legal Services in Broken Hill. And she actually just said that, whilst there was no new funding for legal services, she highlighted the positive aspect by saying that any funding from the government towards closing the gap is a positive outcome.
And we know how important it is, especially in the wake of the failure of the Voice referendum. A lot of where Australians need to move forward has been one of uncertainty and confusion. And given the fact that we know that there are so many of these targets that have to still be addressed on not just a federal level, but a state and even a local level, there is quite a lot to go through. But the fact of the matter is that this government, given the fact that we have had to deal with the results of that referendum, they've now got to try and do some of these solutions many different ways. Are you feeling that are things starting to become a little bit clearer at the moment, or do you think there's still a lot more muddling, especially given that we know that an election's going to be called within a matter of weeks?
Look, yeah, that's an interesting one because, while you've got these targets, what the government says that we're trying to do and trying to get these targets on track, and so it's just unfortunately the reality is not the same. The reality doesn't speak to, what's actually happening out within communities. And the viewpoint is that, advocates such as Megan Cracker, who's, I should say Auntie Megan Cracker, she's a long-standing WA social activist, and she's highly renowned and recognised for her voice. And she's actually running in the WA lead Senate candidate. And so I had an opportunity to speak with her, and she's actually quite atrocious about the announcement of $1.3 billion, which doesn't go far in any way, shape or form. And she's actually saying that this year the government had a missed opportunity to genuinely fix, or address those targets of closing the gap.
And I know that earlier we had Parliament woman Senator Jackie Lambie actually got very, very emotional on breakfast television when she was speaking, and one of her biggest concerns is cuts to issues like Veterans Affairs if the Liberals ever got in. She was very, very emotional, and it was in many ways it was quite moving actually, because we know that Jackie Lambie, apart from of course her Indigenous identity, has been a massive supporter of Veterans Affairs and veterans, given that she's also been an ADF person. We know that the public service itself, if the coalition got in, there had been threats of access to departments and personnel, which could also make a lot more of a domino effect, which could make our public service worse, which could make services delivered to Indigenous people even worse.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's probably one of the concerns as well in terms of, this upcoming election is that community members are quite concerned about what if, this happens or what if we get this result. There's a lot of uncertainty there, and I think that's why community members, and I think with this announcement of this budget in some way has, it's left people or First Nations people feeling deflated, because it seems to be that if this government that we have now, and this is the view that I'm sort of getting from the communities, that if the view is that, from this government, this is, not assisting or not addressing those closing the gap targets, then what's the hope there for the next government?
That is also a very key point. You've also been speaking to a few other members of Parliament in the wake of the Treasurer's budget. Who have you been talking to?
So yes, I did. I had an interview with Lydia Thorpe. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Yes, I did. I had an interview with Lydia Thorpe earlier today here at Parliament House following the announcement of the budget. She did put a media statement out last night calling it or referring to the announcement as crumbs on the table, because what she's saying is that every year there seems to be a decline in the government's every year there seems to be a decline in the government's interest and commitment to First Nations people. And so I had a chat to her about that and about her views and concerns about, this year's federal budget, and this is what she had to say.
Well, given it's all stolen wealth on stolen land, absolutely. It's gammon to have closing the gap money used for the cops is outrageous. That is just continuing the oppression of our people. How can funding cops through closing the gap be okay? Closing the gap, we know, is, a distraction. It's a feel-good morning tea or lunch. It means nothing on the ground. We see the Minister for Indigenous Australians running around the country, saying that we're going to lower the cost of food. Well, that's just great. We've got closing the gap money in this budget paying for pipes and water. They are basic human right necessities. You don't see white people paying for those kinds of things and having special category of funding to fund their drinking water, and it's just a farce.
We also had a couple of other aspects. I know that cost of living has been one of the biggest concerns among the Australian public for the past couple of years. Is there any move among Indigenous Australians about the cost of living relief, such as the proposed tax cuts, the electricity rebates? We also know that a lot of HECS debt is being eliminated, which we know has been a big concern for many Indigenous university students who have been worried about that massive amount of debt that they would eventually have to pay off for many, many years. But also we have this aspect of the Treasurer really trying to encourage more school leavers to get into either TAFE or university to further their career. Have you heard anything about that?
Look, there was very little that was announced in this year's budget, and it seemed to be that some of those issues in relation to such as housing and different aspects in the communities. I know there had been a lot of push from the government as well about food insecurity in remote communities, and so I know that they had already been, like those sorts of programs and initiatives have already been rolled out throughout the year and throughout last year to try and address some of those, high food prices in communities and making sure that people have, clean and sustainable food and energy and resources. But unfortunately, that just still doesn't cover the wider issue. And unfortunately, this year's budget didn't really scrutinise or seem to have, allocated any further funding towards those particular issues. What the budget seemed to focus on is more, of the economic sustainability side for mob and self-determination, to more invest resources to establish, more place-based, I guess, business coaching and programs and mentoring programs for mob in the community. So, when we talk about specific closing the gap targets such as housing, health and well-being, employment, legal services, things like that. Unfortunately, it didn't mention anything about that, or there was nothing that was new about that. And that was sort of the view from people that I spoke with in the community. I had spoken with CEO of the Aboriginal Legal Services, Wayne Nannup, last week in Perth on Noongar Budja when I was there. He had informed me that they had put in a pre-budget submission, but unfortunately they weren't expecting any big changes there. So he's of the view that, on a national scale, Indigenous legal services have always had issues with funding, and that's going to be an issue that will still go on for some time until something's addressed.
And how are you feeling about how Indigenous issues will be covered in the federal election? We've been pretty much in a pre-election mode for practically months, and we're just literally waiting for Anthony Albanese to make that trip to Government House in Canberra. So what are your feelings about what Indigenous issues could be more prevalent, or at least pushed to the forefront? Because given the fact that we have all these issues, as you've mentioned, with closing the gap, that there will be hundreds of thousands of First Nations people who want answers, and want clear-cut answers at that.
Yeah, certainly. I definitely think the view is that the next elected, the next elected government needs to really take these closing the gap targets more seriously. And, as I said, Indigenous activist Megan Cracker, she's expressed her views about feeling very, disappointed and calling out the government, saying how atrocious it was to allocate $1.3 billion. And that's just not going to go anywhere to address the issues. And she actually referred to it as, this year's government has missed an opportunity to, help make things right, or at least help First Nations Australians in terms of closing the gap. So it is a conversation where, as we talked about, there's a lot of uncertainty there. And I think I think people will be waiting to see, well, what's the next government going to do? What are we going to do to better the situation that we are in now? Because when you think about it, four targets, or I think it's 4 or 5 targets out of 19, that's a very small portion of targets that are on track. And that says either we're not doing much, or what we're doing is just not working.
We'll certainly keep an eye out on that. Micah Kickett, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it.
And that's Firstline. We'll bring you everything from the election campaign over the next 5 weeks, where everything and anything can happen. I'm Daniel Pizarro. Thank you so much for your company. See you next week.